I want to say something that is going to sound wrong for the first 5 seconds. And I need you to hold it long enough to hear the full argument. Because if you close the tab before I finish, you are going to make a very expensive assumption. Here it is. The Clarity Act failing might be the single best thing that has ever happened to XRP. Not the passing of it, the failing of it. I know how that sounds. You have been waiting for regulatory clarity for years. You have been told May. You have been told Q4. You have been told it is weeks away, 4 times in 4 consecutive months. And every single deadline has come and gone without a bill. That is exhausting, and I am not going to pretend it isn't. But here is what nobody covering this story is saying out loud. It's the Clarity Act dies in committee, and $3.4 trillion in crypto assets gets frozen in regulatory limbo until 2027 or 2028. XRP is the only major asset in this market that already has its answer. And a market where every competitor is frozen is not a threat to XRP. It is a moat. Welcome back to XRP News Flow Signals, where we read the structure underneath the story, not just the headline. This is not financial advice. Always do your own research. But if you want to understand why the Clarity Act deadlock is being misread as a risk to XRP when the data tells a completely different story, stay with me. This one matters. Let's start with the hard truth that almost every mainstream outlet is getting backwards. The Clarity Act is in a genuine 4-faction deadlock. Senate reformers want a federal framework. Bank-aligned critics are fighting to protect deposit economics. The SEC and CFTC have stopped waiting for Congress and started moving independently. And structural critics warn the bill would gut investor protections before replacements are in place. 4 factions, 4 veto points, 1 bill that cannot move. If the Clarity Act does not clear committee by early summer, Congress pivots to midterm election positioning, and crypto legislation gets quietly shelved. Not for months, but potentially until 2027 or 2028. Now here is the framing error that is costing retail holders clarity of thought. Every piece of coverage treating this deadlock as a risk to XRP is applying the same regulatory framework to XRP that applies to every other asset in this market. And that framework no longer applies to XRP. On March 19th, 2026, the SEC formally classified XRP as a digital commodity alongside Bitcoin. First ever named crypto taxonomy in U.S. regulatory history. One of only 2 assets given that designation. The lawsuit that triggered XRP's delisting from major exchanges in 2020, that cost millions of retail holders access for years, is resolved. The regulatory barrier is not weakened. It is gone. While $3.4 trillion in digital asset market capitalization sits frozen in a legal gray zone waiting for Congress to act, XRP already has its answer from the regulator directly. The Clarity Act, if it passes, gives other assets what XRP already holds. And if it fails, if the deadlock extends into 2027, every asset still waiting for that classification stays off the table for institutional allocators with compliance mandates. Every asset, except XRP. That is not a subtle distinction. That is the entire competitive landscape of institutional crypto allocation reshaped by a bill that cannot get out of committee. The mainstream framing says, Clarity Act delay equals uncertainty for XRP. The structural framing says, Clarity Act delay equals XRP being one of the only investable digital assets for institutional capital during the freeze. Now, let's run the numbers that explain why the stablecoin yield fight is not a technical regulatory debate. It is an economic war. The provision currently holding the entire Clarity Act hostage is a proposed ban on yield payments for passive stablecoin balances. On the surface, it sounds like a minor operational detail about rewards programs. It is not. The stablecoin market represents approximately $230 billion in circulating supply as of this month. A yield-bearing stablecoin that competes with traditional savings products is not a crypto-native curiosity. It is a direct competitor to the U.S. banking system's core revenue model. Here is the math behind the lobbying. The U.S. banking system holds approximately $17.9 trillion in consumer deposits. Under fractional reserve rules, banks deploy the majority of that capital into mortgage portfolios, commercial lending, and short-duration bond positions, generating returns that never appear on depositors' statements. The entire model depends on depositors keeping money inside the banking system. A yield-bearing stablecoin gives depositors an alternative. Every dollar that moves into a yield-bearing stablecoin is a dollar that exits the fractional reserve yield machine. The banks blocking stablecoin yield are not concerned about consumer protection. They are protecting a multi-hundred-billion-dollar annual yield stream generated on capital that belongs to their customers. This is not a $10 billion disagreement. This is an existential economic defense. And it explains exactly why the bill keeps stalling on a provision that looks minor from the outside. Now here is the number that puts XRP's position in full perspective. Ripple was minting 20% of all USDC before launching RLUSD. Read that carefully. Before Ripple built its own institutional stablecoin, it was providing liquidity infrastructure for the dominant USD stablecoin in the market. That is not a company guessing at institutional demand. That is a company with direct operational visibility into how institutional stablecoin flows actually work, who uses them, at what scale, and for what purpose. Ripple did not build RLUSD because they thought there might be demand. They built it because they had better data on that demand than almost anyone else in the market. And RLUSD runs on the XRP Ledger, which means every institutional RLUSD flow, every settlement, every custody operation, every credit facility, like the Gemini $250 million mandate, drives volume through the same network whose commodity classification is already confirmed. The banks fighting stablecoin yield in Congress are fighting the legislation that would unlock RLUSD's competitors. RLUSD's regulatory lane is already open. The math of who benefits from the delay is not ambiguous. Now let's talk about what Brad Garlinghouse actually said at FII Priority Miami, because almost every mainstream outlet reported it incorrectly, and the misreporting is hiding the most important signal of the week. The headline was, Ripple CEO not worried about Clarity Act delay. What Garlinghouse actually said was structurally different and significantly more important. His precise statement, Ripple does not have a major stake in the Clarity Act battle because XRP has already been recognized as a commodity by both the SEC and the CFTC. The bill would give other assets what XRP already holds. That is not a statement of indifference. That is a statement of structural advantage being communicated directly to the room he was standing in. FII Priority Miami is not a retail crypto conference. The audience includes sovereign wealth funds, family offices, and institutional treasury managers. These are entities that evaluate legal risk and deployment timelines before allocating capital. Garlinghouse was not giving a policy update. He was closing a sales argument. The message delivered to that room, the regulatory risk that has kept you on the sideline, is already resolved for XRP. Everything else in this market is waiting on Congress. XRP is not. That sentence delivered in that room to that audience is worth more than any number of retail-facing announcements. Now layer on the SEC and CFTC's independent action. While Congress deadlocks, the SEC and CFTC have already signed a new memorandum of understanding and begun issuing fresh crypto guidance independently. Regulatory lines are being drawn right now, not by legislation, but by agency action. This matters enormously for the assets currently in the gray zone. When enforcement discretion becomes the primary regulatory mechanism because the bill hasn't passed, the assets that already hold formal classifications are not subject to that discretion. They are already classified. XRP is already classified. The CEO of Tucrium captured the institutional read on the deadlock precisely this week. Neither side being happy means there probably is a deal. That's the mark of a really good deal on a complicated subject. Retail reads that as optimism. Institutional reads it as the final text will be deliberately ambiguous in contested areas, and enforcement discretion will fill the gaps. That discretion lives with the SEC and CFTC, not Congress. XRP already has its classification from both agencies. Discretion does not reach it. I want to stop here for a moment, because the inversion we just mapped is the kind of structural read that takes primary sources, not headlines. The mainstream coverage says Clarity Act delay equals risk. The filing level, statement level, agency action level analysis says it equals competitive separation for the one asset that already has its classification. That gap between the headline and the structure is exactly what XRP News Flow Signals exists to close. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the catalyst timeline I am about to lay out is specific, datable, and moving faster than the legislative calendar suggests. You want this analysis in your feed before the price reflects it. That is the only window that matters. Let's be precise about what the next 8 to 10 weeks actually look like, because this is not a vague someday scenario. It has a hard clock attached. The Clarity Act window, 8 to 10 weeks. If the 4 unsolved variables, stablecoin yield language, SEC front door design, exemptive authority, and investor protection provisions do not resolve simultaneously within that window, Congress pivots to midterm positioning. The bill gets shelved, the freeze begins, and XRP, already classified, becomes one of the only digital assets institutional capital can legally touch during that freeze. If the bill passes, every asset currently frozen gets the classification XRP already holds. The repricing event is broad, but XRP reprices from a position that is already established, already integrated into institutional products, already running live payment corridors through a $156 trillion annual FX flow market. If the bill stalls, the institutional capital that would have been distributed across the broader market concentrates into the assets that are already cleared. XRP is at the top of that list. The SEC/CFTC independent action timeline. Regulatory guidance is already being issued without congressional authorization. The lines being drawn now will define which assets qualify for institutional treatment, regardless of whether the bill passes. XRP's classification is already documented in both agencies' records. Garlinghouse's sovereign wealth fund conversations, these are not public announcements. They are deployment discussions, and the timeline on sovereign wealth fund allocation cycles is measured in quarters, not news cycles. Both outcomes point in the same direction for XRP. That is not a coincidence. That is a structural position. Here is the uncomfortable truth that most retail holders are not sitting with. You have been told May, February, Q4 2025, 4 consecutive months, 4 named deadlines, 4 misses. That exhaustion is real, and it is doing exactly what it is designed to do. Institutional accumulation does not happen at a press conference. It happens quietly, during the exact window when retail frustration peaks and the supply of an already classified asset becomes available from holders who break before the deployment begins. The delay is not random. The window of retail frustration is the window of institutional positioning. The question is not whether the structure resolves. It is whether you are still holding when it does. Let me leave you with the complete inversion. The Clarity Act is failing. 4 factions, 4 veto points. A hard clock ticking toward a freeze that could lock $3.4 trillion in crypto assets out of institutional reach until 2027 or later. And XRP, the asset that survived a 4-year SEC lawsuit, that was delisted and relisted, that watched its community hold through the worst years in crypto history, is the one asset in this market that already has the answer the Clarity Act is supposed to provide. Not because of luck, because of a commodity classification confirmed on March 19, 2026 by the same regulator that sued Ripple in 2020. The bill that is failing is not a threat to XRP. It is the event that proves XRP does not need it. If this structural read changed how you see the deadlock, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals before the summer window closes. The next 8 to 10 weeks are the most consequential legislative window this market has seen. We will be tracking every faction move, every agency filing, and every institutional signal in real time. Drop one word below. Moat if the inversion landed. Waiting if you are still processing it. Stay sharp. The signal does not lie. Not financial advice. Always conduct your own research.